Hello, I'm Tom Ferguson and welcome to The Fundamental Molecule. This show explores the intersection of water, technology, and entrepreneurship. Each week, I interview innovators, experts, entrepreneurs, and investors in the world of water, helping us understand where this trillion-dollar industry is headed. These are the stories of the people building the future of the world's most valuable and fundamental resource.
Disclaimer. Tom Ferguson is the managing partner of Overton Island Ventures. All opinions expressed by Tom and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Overton Island Ventures. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be viewed as investment advice or relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.
The idea of an Overton window, when the conditions around a political issue change that in turn changes the nature of what is politically possible, is a useful one in assessing businesses. Sometimes conditions change enough in a market or sector that there is suddenly a significant window of opportunity for a founder to run through. We think that is the case with Michael Rigney, CEO of Cala Systems. They're building a next-generation heat pump water heater, and if they're right, they could save billions of gallons of water, reduce US national emissions by 3%, and save domestic energy consumers about $23 billion a year. We talk about the nature of the water heater market, competing against entrenched incumbents, and rebuilding a well-known consumer product from the ground up. He has major gain in this segment, and Cala are in a fascinating position. Please enjoy my conversation with Michael Rigney. Michael, it's excellent to see you. I saw you last week. I'm seeing you this week. Welcome to The Fundamental Molecule.
Thank you, Tom. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So we're going to dive literally right into it. So why go after the water heater market?
Definitely not starting with any warm-ups. So fundamentally, the decision to go after the water heater market emerged from really three observations. And the first of those was that heat pump water heaters would rise. And this is really the timeline here is 2020. And the observation in the belief was heat pump water heaters will rise from essentially being less than 1% of the market to being over 50% of the market, and that creates an opportunity, an important opportunity for company building and for climate change impact. And the second is the observation and belief that the products could be made significantly better. And I'm sure that we'll get into that. And then the third, coming from an entrepreneurial perspective, was not seeing other people doing it. And I've been in energy and climate startups for 20 years. It's really easy to look around oftentimes when you have an intriguing idea and very quickly find other companies that have been at it for a couple of years. And that wasn't the case here. That was the third sort of piece that really caused me to say, okay. And it was a moment of actually standing up from my desk, going for a walk around the neighborhood for an hour and thinking to myself, yeah, I think I may have found something that's worth, a decade or more of my life. However, that led into just going out and having a whole bunch of conversations and doing research for probably 4 months before concluding, okay, yeah, this is here.
Fantastic. It really was as strong as that you sort of felt, oh, hang on, this is too big and I can't find anyone else doing this. And for me, with my set of experiences, this feels wildly obvious. And let's go and find out whether or not it's true. That's like a decent encapsulation of what struck you.
Yeah, there was pretty strong pattern recognition very clearly.
Yeah.
And part of it was that for me, it was the three things that I just cited, but there was additional detail behind that. A couple of things. The first was my pathway into looking at water heating was actually coming across a piece of intellectual property. And we did end up actually, and it is a core to what we're doing, we did end up licensing that IP. And it's predictive control for heat pump water heaters. And it's a terrific patent developed by very talented scientists out of the National Renewable Energy Lab. And it applies a powerful, known, proven technique known as model predictive control to water heating. So one of the entry points for me was, as someone who has worked in electricity for 20 years and has a background in the thermal sciences, predictive control is just incredibly valuable. Yeah. It's very clear that in a water heater, the ability to know what is likely to happen just unlocks a lot of value. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing was it was very, at the time, it was apparent, and it's even more apparent now, that heat pump water heaters save a tremendous amount of money against half the market. And from my background as an entrepreneur and a business person, that's something you really got to look hard at, is to understand what is the value proposition? Is it there? Are people going to find that compelling? It's easy to say that, but nevertheless, I think a lot of businesses get started where it turns out to not be the case. And we just had a lot of confidence just in looking at the raw economics that the payback is there.
So take us through those 4 months that you were like, lightning bolt, Michael goes on a walk, and then Michael does a lot of work to find out what reality is. What did that actually look like? Where did you even start? Because if you told me to go and do 4 months of work to discover the reality of the water, I mean, I would be able to, just the beginning, but like actually the concrete reality of like who you spoke to, how you structured it, what you were looking for. It's such an important part of the process and is a big differentiator. Any reflections there practically that other?
It's a really fun question to think about, from where we are now in the journey, and it's a long journey. Number one, the one precept was, get out of the building and talk to everybody I could. So was reaching out to, my network, which is primarily in the energy and climate space, as I mentioned before. There was cold outreach to researchers in various aspects of sort of energy demand response on the residential side in particular, and also on heat pump water heaters too. There was cold outreach to NREL itself, which always puts a smile on my face because a lot of my personal career is in selling and in managing sales teams. And every salesperson I know has a special place in their heart for cold calls that end up resulting in deals. And I was joking recently with our licensing agent about the fact that I was just some guy who reached out to them out of the blue about a particular patent. And we're on the cusp now of moving it into the market. So that was part of the 4 months, is reaching out to NREL to inquire about the IP and taking out an option on it. And so took out an option on it. So we had a year to go and turn that into a license, which we did. And then just going back, just a ton of conversations, just talking to everybody I could, taking notes, understanding the economics, building simple models to understand the space, and really looking at it from a fundamental perspective of, will this technology take share over time? Will it grow significantly over time? And the conclusion that we came to, of course, was, yeah, it will. And there's really good reason to believe that it will over time.
Let's establish, what is it that you're building?
So we're building the world's first intelligent heat pump water heater. And it's not just software intelligence per se, using model predictive control, the algorithm that I mentioned. It's a full stack redesign of how the water heater should operate. And so a water heater today, including heat pump water heaters, let's talk about from a tank perspective. We can come back and talk about tankless, which has a lot of mind share. But the design principle for a tank water heater is to put heat into the tank when the water is cold. That's how it operates. Our perspective is fundamentally different. It is that we're going to optimize water heating for comfort, for cost, and to take into consideration whatever other preferences that homeowner has. And so and we'll come back to that too. But to do that, just to walk through it verbally, we have a flow meter. And so we learn the usage patterns of hot water in every home. And that is the necessary basis for optimization, to know what is likely to occur from the hot water usage perspective. That's number one. Number two, we use that, of course, to build a prediction into going out approximately 24 hours of likely hot water use. Then we also ingest all sorts of information, whatever you might think of that is of interest. We're going to pull that in with an IoT structure. So that might be the carbon intensity. It might be the solar forecast for the home, for that locality, that zip code. It might be a prediction of weather over the next 24 hours, including whether or not there's going to be sort of a major weather event and we should just preheat the tank. So all those data streams come in, they flow into our predictive control algorithm, which is able to inherently examine and take into account that information. And that's actually saying a lot, because most control algorithms for hardware don't natively deal with future information, and model predictive control actually does. It's one of its many benefits for this use case. And then we generate control signals for the compressor and for the temperature of the water in the tank. Many other things too, but those are the two fundamental ones. We have a variable speed compressor as opposed to a fixed speed compressor. Most heat pump water heaters have a single speed compressor. Well, we can run our compressor faster to generate more heat, which is good if you've got more demand coming for hot water. And we can run it slower. And when you slow it down, you increase the efficiency of the heat pump by quite a bit, by up to 30%. And so that's pretty fundamental too. And then we have a mixing valve. The mixing valve, as the name suggests, mixes in cold water at the outlet of the water heater. And that allows us to separate the temperature in the tank from the delivery temperature. Why is that important? Because it gives us the freedom, therefore, to overheat the water when it makes sense to do so. So if there's really high demand from the family, everyone's going to take a shower on, say, a Tuesday morning, then we're going to overheat the water in the tank. And then via the mixing valve, you get a very consistent temperature, and you don't have two people fighting in the hallway, likely the kids, about who gets to take the warm shower, because essentially the tank size is dynamic. And the thing that I would say about this architecture, I know I ran through that pretty quickly. I'd invite folks to go to our website. We've got a really great flow diagram under how it works that takes people through that, is we're taking in information. We have the ability to utilize all of that information. And we've got the hardware components that allow us to control the device. And that's really important too. So it's not just about better software. You really have to do better sensors, better software, and better hardware too, and put that all together in a different architecture.
I love all of it. I mean, I just literally last week, I went to go and see the system in place for the first time. And there's actually something about what I saw there that I'd love to ask you about. But before that, just looking through the eyes of the customer, is that what they care about is enough hot water at the right temperature and in enough quantity for them to be able to do the thing that they want to do at the time that they want to do it, and to not notice that you are a thing. So how do you think about mapping out your value proposition to the customer? What is it that you are selling them as you think about establishing this in the market?
What we think about first and foremost is what people care about, which is they want comfortable hot water and they want it at low cost. And if you think about this from the jobs to be done framework, that's job number one, right? Is just people want comfortable hot water whenever they want it for their family. They want to be confident that it's there, and they want it at low cost. And so that's the first thing that we focus on in the product. And that's what it's built to do, literally. What's really interesting, though, is that in addition, we can do all sorts of things that have never been done before, right? And I started to mention these briefly before. So let's come back to some of them. We can have the water heater coordinate with the solar system on the roof, with a battery system, with price signals and participate in demand response. And a little bit of that has been done before, particularly the economic side. It's worth mentioning that, but it's been done in a very top-down mass management way, as opposed to a device-specific customized way. And then, we can do a host of other things that people haven't been able to do before, like integrate with a home where people may say, hey, I don't want the heat pump water heater to operate between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. because people tend to watch TV in the room next to it. Like, okay, we'll just plan around that, right? These are all things that you can do. The theory here is what we call useful intelligence. It's not intelligence for the sake of engineers who are excited about it on our team, and we are all excited about it. It's useful intelligence in people's homes, and it's independent intelligence too. It goes and does its job after you say, hey, this is what's important to me. It takes it from there.
Talk to us a little bit about brand. One of the things that I think when we decided to come in is that we agreed is that when people say you're unlikely or you can't brand a water heater, I think they're dead wrong. This is as ubiquitous as the toaster in the home. Like, you can absolutely brand a water heater. But how do you think about that? You've just relaunched your website, public launch of the company about whatever it was, a month ago or 6 weeks ago. How do you think about the notion of brand?
We think about it, Tom, from the perspective of starting where is the customer at, and how do they think about what they want to accomplish in their home. We're not operating under any sort of misconception that people are going to think about brand for water heater in the same way that they're going to think about brand for car, right? That's not going to happen. But on the other hand, if you think about, here's how we do look at it, is when you delight people, then you have the opportunity to create an association with them, between them and the product. And that's the basis for building brand. And so do the job really well. This goes back to what we were talking about before, about the job to be done, and then go further and delight them. That's the opportunity to go and build a brand in a space where people might not think that you could do it. And two additional points I would make there. The first is that Nest really showed, of course, that you can go and build a branded product in a category that was, prior to their launch, considered completely a commodity. And so I think if done properly, it can be done. And then the second is that utilities have a really interesting framework, and it's really a company called Opower that many people have heard of course, that served utilities that came up with this framework called, moments that matter. What are the moments where someone interacts with their utility that they really care about? And that I think is a really good framework for a more utilitarian product like a water heater. There's a limited number of opportunities. If you get them right, then, you can have that strong connection with people. And that's the platform on which you build brand.
So just taking it a step sort of further in, like you just relaunched the website. What were you thinking about the design principles of your principal shop window, which is what your website is? Like, talk us through the process that you went through to be able to happen on the website design. I encourage everybody to go. It's calasystems.com. It's beautiful. And actually, given that I walked through the process with you, I thought it was super interesting how well you synthesized a bunch of different lessons from elsewhere. But just take a second to talk about designing the shop window.
And I think that this is a great next topic of conversation after brand, because it does tie back to brand. Here's the way that it does is we think that as a company focused solely on heat pump water heaters, we have something to say about where this industry should go, what it should accomplish for society, and what it should deliver to homeowners. And having that perspective is an important part of brand building as well. And the website is the first, there will be many, but it is the first way in which we go and start to tell that story. So we've spent a lot of time with our brand development firm. We went through the whole process. So visual, name, what does the brand stand for, et cetera. So, and then ultimately down into the details of the actual content itself. And, hey, is this the right color? Is this the right picture? All of those myriad details. But we spent a lot of time on brand positioning. And here we had tremendous help from our design firm. And I think one of the things that we were very aware of is that there's actually a really important emotional aspect to hot water. It is something that we use every day, many, many times. It is something that is therefore woven into the fabric of our lives. And so the phrase feel good comfort arises first and foremost from the fact that hot water needs to, and it is critical that it delivers comfort to us. But really interestingly, there's all these other attributes on top of it that we're seeking to deliver to consumers and that many of them want. And that's the feel-good part of the comfort as well. That starts with economic savings, of course, but then it's integration with the home. It's helping people realize their aspiration to contribute to the fight against climate change in their own daily life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that is part of our mission, all of it put together.
So just to everybody's listening, tell us what's at stake here, because the gross numbers, even if you're just talking in terms of the US, are enormous in terms of emissions as well as customer savings. Just walk us through it.
It is, and it's surprising. It's surprising. So residential water heating is the second largest use of energy in the home at 19%, according to the Department of Energy. And it is 3% of greenhouse gas emissions by itself, just the hot water in your home. And so, decarbonizing water heating is important because it allows us to go after, that 3% right there. But here's something that's fascinating and encouraging and energizing is it's really achievable. There are so many hard problems that we're trying to tackle in climate change. Decarbonizing the manufacturing of steel. Here, we're just trying to make hot water. And so the way that we're going to decarbonize hot water is that we're going to use heat pumps, because that's going to make it all electric, and it's going to result in massive efficiency gains, like 80% reduction in the electricity required to heat water as compared to an electric resistance water heater, and very, very achievable number. So that's hugely important. But then what we're going to do is we're going to do that water heating when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. And it's really that simple. The vision for this company for Cala Systems is 125 million water heaters in America, and ultimately other countries too, heating their water when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. And that's 3% of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States right there. And everyone can participate in that by choosing to buy not just a heat pump water heater, but buy ours, turn on the feature where the water heating is synchronized with how clean your local electricity is, or with the solar on your roof. And that will immediately cause the water heating to be, again, synced up with the cleanest electricity, and we will drive towards that decarbonization. That's how it works.
it's such a fascinatingly huge prize. And it does, as you say, it just feels like it's sort of fundamentally more achievable. And it's this thing that's just sort of lying around. You can just, not pick it up off the floor, because it's going to segue into the next thing I want to talk about, which is you've done an awful lot of work to get where you are. Before we get on to kind of, design principles and what it's like in the workshop and how you're thinking about the transition to your next stage, I just want to talk about team for a second, because it was really striking meeting them all in person, is that uniformly you've held an extremely high standard for the people that you work with. So starting with your co-founder, and it's one of those things where it's not like you sort of like showed up with somebody that you've been like working with forever. Actually, this is a relatively inorganic co-founder story compared to some. Can you just walk us through that story and how you thought about it? Maybe what you know of how Mike thought about it, as long as he's telling you the truth.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So we talked earlier in the podcast about the process of coming to the decision, to commit to go and building the company. And as I finished that, so like late spring in 2020, my thoughts turned to, okay, what are the skill sets I need to bring in to the company first to complement my own? And pretty quickly, it was clear that that was mechanical engineering. And my own background is in mechanical engineering, but on the more of the thermal side, not the actual hardware side. And my career clearly has been in business, not in the delivery of products. And so I went looking for that, developed a sort of co-founder job description, put it out there in the world. And Mike's got a great group of friends from his childhood. And one of them reached out because he worked in clean tech. And we talked, and I said, hey, love your background. It's too similar to my own. You're not the right person. And he happened to see Mike at a barbecue and said, hey, what do you think about this? Mike had, and that's how we met. Mike had spent years at Bose, where he had led one of the redesigns of their flagship QC over-the-ear product. And then he'd been at Shark Ninja. So he had a terrific background. We met during COVID. I mean, we would go and sit in a park overlooking the harbor in Boston.
Oh, God.
And just talk, like 10 feet apart and just get to know each other. And then work through all of those questions, the 50 plus questions you want to do to understand the fit. We're both from New England. We both grew up playing a lot of sports. So there's a lot of similarity there just in how we're wired. And then, launched into it in the fall.
Fantastic. And then the building out of the team, you've been able to combine, people always say hire slowly, and then they hire incredibly slowly. But you've been able to, in general, like it hasn't taken kind of a million years. You've got a strong instinct. How do you think about hiring? How do you think about the structure around which because you've been able to be efficient as well as hire some pretty exceptional people. So what can people learn?
Yeah, thank you. So we were, after raising the seed round in the December timeframe last year, we were able to hire quickly, in part because we had begun so beforehand. We had put out certain critical JDs beforehand and we're running at it. And we had been cultivating some key hires along through the fall, and we're able to bring them in. And so I think it was about preparation and execution. And, as is always the case with startups, I think some good fortune as well, because some companies going through the downturn, at the beginning of 2025 made hiring easy for us. But I think trying to get ahead of it, I think that that's a theme for us, is trying to have headlights and to see what's coming down the road to the extent that we can. And not that process is ever perfect, but it's what you want to endeavor to do.
I just want to try and take people inside the workshop that I saw at the end of last week. My abiding impression was of people who struck a really interesting balance between the methodical nature of their thought and their ability to act like, guerrillas in order to execute what needed to be executed. I mean, you were just talking about the job to be done and the degree of like entrepreneurship on the workshop floor in order to find the solution, but also not just find a solution, find something that was really going to work and jerry rig if required, and et cetera, et cetera. There's a depth of thought that manifests in the thoroughness of the solutions while also being extremely scrappy that I just thought was really striking. I mean, the answer may be very simple in that this is just how we do things, and so it's just how we do things. But how do you reflect on that? Does that kind of ring any bells?
I think so. I mean, how do we think about what we're doing is maybe one way to go at it. Interestingly, one of the fundamental ways that we think about what we're doing is that we're operating in a mature product category, and we're not doing fundamental science. We're doing what I would call executional hardware. That creates an opportunity for us to really limit risk. There's so much risk in starting a new company that anytime you have the opportunity to limit risk, boy, that's awesome. What a gift that is. And so we do really value learning from what we can in the industry around us and leveraging, the very large industry that exists today, for water heaters. And we've largely been able to do that. And then, in the areas that we need to go and attack, we seek to break the problem down into its constituent pieces. And this is where I think the engineers are really talented in their thought process in how to decompose a problem into individual steps and then execute against it over time. And I think we are big believers in incremental progress, surfacing the data, learning from what we have seen, and then you get back out the next day and you do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you've been building this, you said something early in our process that I think is going to stay with me for a very long time, which is this idea of building the company that you're going to have to be eventually. There's all sorts of IP and trade secrets and things that you don't want to be open about, and I completely get it. But just walk us through the mindset. And if you can, give us a couple of ideas of where it's manifested itself in kind of company building choices that you've made that maybe other founders wouldn't have done. And I get it if it needs to be slightly nebulous.
It is a really fun and important topic for us as a company because we're doing hardware. I think the timelines are long, and because we're in a mature industry, I think that stakeholders, including potential investors around the company, can be expected and do have questions about, okay, well, what is this going to look like in 5 years? What is this going to look like in 8 years? And I think that after spending a lot of time on those questions, what we realized is that there are certain attributes in doing hardware and in this industry. So I'll choose one example that I don't think is too nebulous is we really value working with installers and forming relationships with professional installers. And we think that if you look at products that go into the built environment, manufacturers go and do that. They spend time with installers and they get to know them and they form stable, healthy, productive relationships over a long period of time. And that takes some level of investment to go and do. But it's worth doing because it's part of what makes a company successful over time in this particular industry. And I think that is a very good example of building the company that you need to be out 5-7 years and to do that from the beginning, because I don't think that you can just dial it up, in year 5 after you've figured out how to do something different in years 1 through 4.
It speaks to a really interesting idea that we run into all the time. And I feel like it's often misunderstood, is that people sometimes lose sight of the fact that the customer is the person who gives you money. So when you're going kind of B2B to C and you're going to go through kind of an installer strategy, you actually still got to build the thing that will be attractive to the final customer. But you've also got to make sure that that intermediary is on your side. So you're kind of dealing with two slightly different sets of value propositions. You've got to build a thing that is going to delight the customer, but will also delight the installer. So you're kind of balancing these two things. I think it might be slightly because you're not pursuing kind of like a completely intermediary or installer or distributor based strategy. It's kind of diluted from the distilled version of this problem. How have you thought about that? Keeping kind of eyes trained on two things at the same time? Or is it actually, if you just solve it for one, do you solve it for the other?
No, it's definitely not the latter, that if you solve it for one, you solve it for the latter. I think that in this particular product category at this moment in time, you do need to solve it for both jointly. It's independent, essentially marketing and sales to both homeowners who are good, we believe are a good fit for the product in garnering their attention and getting their interest. And it is then in concert with that, marketing and sales to the installers and getting them involved as well. And there's some really practical reasons for that. Unfortunately, for a lot of homeowners right now, if you want to buy a heat pump water heater, it's hard. It's hard to get an installer who is comfortable doing it, will not push back against it. And so there's a really practical problem to be solved, which is someone in a given zip code outside of, name your city, wants to install a heat pump water heater, and connecting them, with an installer who says, sure, I get it. You want that one? I'm going to give it to you. That in and of itself is a really pragmatic reason for going out and speaking to each of these two stakeholders. But I think it's also worth saying that there are I think a lot of business models where working with two communities, two stakeholder groups is a really common thing to do. In various aspects of enterprise sales have this, where you might be working with a VAR as well as working with the end customer. Certainly you see that sometimes with industrial customers. So perhaps it feels a little bit foreign to be doing it with consumers, but I think there are lots of other models too.
So how are you thinking about focus at the moment? There's an extreme version of this, which, and I know you spoke to him the other day, is kind of Sean Grundy at Bevy, which is that if we can't cycle to our first customers, then we're not going to do anything at all. They're only in Boston. They were another Greentown Labs company. That's the extreme version of this. How are you thinking about the initial deployments and going through the process of doing the things that can't scale and providing an awesome experience to your customers and all the rest of it? Where are you on that part of the process?
It's really similar to where Bevy started, and I had a fantastic conversation with him. He was really supportive.
He's a good guy.
He's a really great guy. Real pleasure to speak with. And he shared with me some of their experience. And so when we launch next year, we will be focused initially on the Northeast, where we have easy physical access to. And then, when we're seeing the product and market dynamics that make sense, we will expand out from that geographically. We will be focused, to borrow the word from your question, we will be focused on that initial geography that is a lot closer to home.
So many self-compounding advantages to doing that because it looks an awful lot. And just one other thing that comes up, and I'm not going to ask you to say anything about it, but it's just for people listening. If you were to take one thing away, and we are going to ask you our closing question, so like whatever, but you probably won't say this, but I want to say it, is that for those listening, the degree of practicality of this team is absolutely amazing. To the degree to which I think you guys respect the fact that people don't want to learn to do anything different ever, and make sure that that's kind of a foundational part of your kind of design principles and making everything feel as familiar as you can while delivering completely differentiated performance is very wise. So as you said, you've been in climate tech for 20 years, which makes you, no like disrespect, kind of an OG in this world. I started in 2008, late 2008, so you beat me by 5 years. What are your observations about how it's changed? And how do you think about what water should learn from energy? Because you've been on the energy side of things, you're now interacting with the fundamental molecule. How do you see the overall patterns of this changing, and what do you think water can learn from energy?
So a couple of thoughts. I think that the first wave of what's called, often called clean tech really gets beaten up, right? And so is regarded as just sort of being all failures. The story is a lot more nuanced than that. And Matt Norton over at Prime Impact has written a really thoughtful piece that goes into what did and didn't work there. There were quite a few successes. There were absolutely quite a lot of failures, but there were some really notable successes too. Whether you want to talk about it, Tesla, of course, or you want to talk about some of the AMI companies from that era. You want to talk about Enernoc, where I was. Talk about Converge also from the demand response space. And so I obviously, as an operator, really was focused and sort of in narrowly, right, at the companies that I was at. And so I think one of the things that I took away from that and from subsequent parts of my career as well is really focusing at the beginning on the value proposition for the people who are buying it. What is it actually going to shake out to be for them? Why are they going to buy this? What are their alternatives to buying it? And I think that startups do well when markets come into existence. And a lot of, I think, startup failures occur, not all of them, don't get me, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but a lot of startup failures occur when the market simply does not come into existence in the window in which that company is operating. And as an entrepreneur, I think I want to spend a lot of time on those two things up front. Like, do I think this category is going to come into existence and do well? So are the macro conditions right? And is the value proposition there at a micro perspective? And I think that, it's okay. So let me bring that forward to today. I think the urgency around climate change is obviously different. Hopefully it will continue going forward. And so that can and hopefully will create the conditions that I just described, right? For greater success. And certainly we need it. We need it over the coming decades from a climate change perspective. But I inflect my voice that way because it's not guaranteed, right? It's not guaranteed that those things will occur. And so I think that entrepreneurs have to and leaders have to do the work, do their assessment of whether or not they think that's actually going to happen. And I think that probably carries over to water as well. I think in many of the same respects as it does for energy.
There's an awful lot of work to be done, and the advantages that these markets are absolutely enormous. By the way, interesting, Matt Norden, amazing guy. Steve and I were just talking about him in the car yesterday. Hello, Matt Norden, if you happen to be listening to this. Before we get to our final question, I just want to ask you about the changing nature of your role. This is the first time that you've taken kind of the entrepreneurial wheel as the person with whom the buck stops. You've been a part of some ferociously successful stories previously, but you took the plunge on becoming a founder. The previous, I believe it's CRO of ServiceNow, who is now a partner at Coa2, was just talking about, like, I'm an operator and I will never be a CEO, but I've taken companies from whatever, 5 million to 100 billion or whatever of revenue. They're just like extraordinary stories, but he was adamant that he would never be a CEO. So just walk us through the mindset change to wanting to like go and take this in your hands rather than finding something for which you had already had the school of experience, the training, etc., versus being the, as I say, the person with whom the buck stops. How did you think about it?
For better or worse, I always wanted to.
Right.
So yeah.
And thank God, right? Because you're really good at it.
Yeah. Let's check in a decade. Just said like an operator, I guess. No, I think that maybe to unpack that a little bit, I first encountered startups in early 99 when a brother of mine asked me to go and join him in starting a company that became Blue Tar Financial, which actually provides a service to contractors. And so gave me my first deep exposure to that space. And I really enjoyed that. And it I think left a desire in me to, I really like the way you phrase this, to sort of move into the driver's seat when I found the right opportunity. I think for me, the primary driver for that is to challenge myself and, see if I can do it. There was a belief that I could. And, I'm on the journey to see if that's true.
Yeah, I've got to say, in terms of entrepreneurial process, I mean, just in the meeting that we just had, one of your observers rightly said, it's just so impressive. For every problem that you encounter, you have 4 solutions. And it's one of the best encapsulations of what I think really good entrepreneurial process looks like. So it really has been a pleasure to work with you on it. So our final question, Michael, here it is, the one that we ask all of our guests on the Fundamental Molecule. What is the single most important piece of advice for future and aspiring water entrepreneurs?
Well, thank you for your compliment before. I want to say that before I move on. I think the answer I'm going to give is likely not just for water entrepreneurs. It's for entrepreneurs in general. It's something I've alluded to before, and it is to sincerely try to disprove your idea at the outset so that you can put it down and move on to something else. And there's just a whole bunch of good things that come from doing that. Walking away, like I walked away in 2013 from something I'd looked at for almost a year in the solar space. And I finally was able to actually develop the right analysis. And when I finished that analysis, I put it down that day and never picked it up because I just proved to myself that it wouldn't work. It's just a very high commitment activity. You've got to be, your toughest board, so to speak, before you go out, try to make it real in the real world. And so I would say spend the time on that. And what that really means is, from a process perspective, is don't look for the evidence that it will work. You actually really go and look for the evidence and construct the questions to sincerely try to prove that it won't work.
Absolutely love that. There's like, what's your largest piece of advice? Oh, we happen to do that. I don't want to be that guy. But when we were thinking about our opportunity fund, that's exactly the process we did. We were like, okay, all 3 of us, Christine, Steve, and I, let's go and just see if we can kick this thing hard enough and see if it breaks. And when it didn't, it actually really helpful because you then have this sort of grounding that it doesn't feel like a risk. It feels like you've already gone around it. So as we're going through the process of getting that in place, it's like, look, this is just something that we think is going to happen. It's going to happen sooner or it's going to happen later, but it's going to happen. So it really, really helps, I've found anyway, with the experiences you're going through, because you've got that degree of certitude, or at least confidence that it's going to happen. I love that. Fantastic. Well, it's also very characteristic, Michael, because you're rather good at what you do. Really appreciate you taking the time. Always. It's a huge pleasure to be a very, very small part of the Cala Systems story. And thank you, Michael, for being on the Fundamental Molecule.
Thank you for having me, Tom. You're definitely not a small part of what we're doing over here at Cala. And so thank you for all of your support.
Cheers.
Cheers.